Hi, everyone, for joining this presentation. Before I introduce myself, I would like to first thank everyone for giving away an hour of your time, thinking that it is well spent. I'll try my best. If not, keep you engaged. At a minimum, I'll try to entertain you with some of the stories I'm about to share with you today. With that, my name is Ravi Gampala. I'm your presenter for today. And the topic is executive presentations and some best practices. The style that we would like to use today is more of sharing best practices, but it's not prescriptive. So, in a sense, I'll be telling you what you already know. And don't feel that I'm wasting my time, but sometimes reinforcing what you already know can also be a good thing. So, before we get into the presentation, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. One second. So for the last 16 years, I spent a while at Google building many products, mostly in advertising space. The main products that I built are in search advertising, video advertising, and display advertising space. Only in the last couple of years, I spent a bit of time in Google Cloud Business Unit, where I have helped my team build products for infrastructure resource management. This is a very specialized space. I don't want to get into too many details, but think of it as when Google search needs certain infrastructure resources in a given location at a given time, how would they manage to get those resources? That is the problem space that we are talking about. But of course, in such a way that the resources are optimally put to use and minimum amount of inventory is used for unknown demand of the product. So without getting too much more into the depth, if time comes, we'll spend some time, but I would like to stop there as far as my background is concerned. And as for today, we would like to go through 5 different stories, and they are organized into before your presentation and during the presentation. Let's go to the next slide. So for the sake of telling the stories in a nice way for you, I have organized the couple of stories, what to do before your presentation and what to do during the presentation. So specifically, the best practices that I'm referring to here have to do something with socializing the deck with some key players. And what it means is that your stakeholders are the beneficiaries of your product. If they have the opportunity to be present during your presentation, make sure that you share the deck with them ahead of time, so you get the feedback from them, and they feel that they have been heard, and you feel that you heard them. Right? These are 2 very important bidirectional communication aspects. So I won't get into the rest of the best practices because along the way, we will visit them anyway. But one word I would like to give you before we get to the stories is that I'll use the structure for telling the stories using the star L format. What it means is that first I'll explain you the situation. That is what S stands for. And task and or action is what was done or what was expected of the presenter. R stands for then result, what really happened. And finally, when we look back, what do we learn from that experience? So that is what I'm calling as star L format. And without further ado, let's get to our first story. So I'm not going to read these slides, as a articulated here. That is something for you to kind of like look at. But the main part of the story that I would like to tell you today is that, as I was telling you a few minutes ago, it's very important for your stakeholders to review the slide deck before the executive presentation. And the story that I'm sharing with you today is my own experience when I was the product manager for the sales revenue data mart. which I inherited as a product fraught with lots of issues. So the first and foremost problem was that the data was incorrect at times, not always, at times. And therefore, people used to call it untrustworthy data. The second and another bigger problem was that the data was stale when they were accessing it. This is more of a perception, right? Because the users might feel when they're looking at the data, they might feel that they're looking at the data as of now or as of certain date or a timestamp, but the reality does not match with the user's expectation. That is what let's refer to as data staleness or the staleness of the data or lack of freshness, right? So that is what I've inherited. But then the task at hand for me was to basically come back with a proposal. How do we rebuild or revamp the revenue data mart so that the data is fresh, and second, the numbers or the metrics are reliable and trustworthy, right? Very simple to explain. Of course, I'm not trying to trivialize the difficulty involved in actually fixing these problems. So that basically defines the situation. Now let's get to what the task or action at hand was. And since I mentioned to you that I'm the product manager, I'm actually supposed to have walked the slides through with my partners, or rather the stakeholders in sales operations, sales and finance, because they are the primary users of the sales revenue data mart. Now, the expectation I had was that since I'm very familiar with the problems, because I've spoken to my stakeholders, I thought that there is no reason for me to revamp the known facts again with them. This is just my perspective. I'm not saying I'm right or wrong. And second, it's their problem that I'm solving, so they should be on my side because we're all playing on the same side to get the problem solved. So that was my thinking at the time, and we then walked into the presentation. Now, let me just tell you the result. What really happened on that time? At that time, as soon as I started talking about the problems and not even talking about the solution, my partners felt that I'm representing the problems in a wrong order. Specifically, I was talking about the data freshness as a problem, and by no means I was saying that it was the main problem or it was the fundamental problem. My sales and finance stakeholders started jumping in and saying that, you need to fix the untrustworthiness aspect of the data first, because that is of higher priority. And you are presenting the problem in a wrong order. This is not the right priority. So I started, trying to tell them that this is just the list of problems, and I'm stating them here before we get to the solution part. And of course, I'm always going to focus on what is the bigger and more important problem to fix. But that, did not really go well, as more and more people started, picking on the fact that the issues are presented in a wrong order from their perspective. So there is nothing for me to argue. And soon enough, I was piled on by a lot of people who are saying the same thing from their perspective in a different way. And as one might call it, I have seen or experienced the pile-on effect for the first time. And it was not pretty. So on one hand, I was telling myself, why am I doing all this? I'm trying to build a product for the benefit of my stakeholders, and how come they're not on my side? But regardless of how I felt at that time, it was partly successful, presentation, and partly unsuccessful, because I didn't come out as a successful person from that presentation, but still we managed to go through the problem and the solutions, which was actually a good thing. But if I were to look back, obviously there is definitely an important learning that I never, I never try to repeat the same problem while I was at Google, and hopefully even in future. So the learning from that experience is that get input and the buy-in from your stakeholders, because they are the ones who will support you when you're presenting, so that the executives feel that you have the full support of your stakeholders, not just representing their problems, but also the priorities and the importance and the value to the stakeholders are captured in the right order. So that is what I would like to call as the biggest takeaway from this story. Get feedback from your stakeholders, priority your presentation, walk in with their support, you will do fine. So that is the gist of the story number one. So I'd like to pause here for a second and kind of transition to our second story of the day. So the second story of the day is actually an interesting experience that one of my coworkers had gone through while I was watching along with the executives during one of the presentations. So let's just talk about the situation using our star L model again. The situation was that my coworker, another product manager, was presenting a so-called budget recommender. What this product is supposed to do is to look at an advertiser, their behavior, their spend behavior, to be more precise. In the past, their preferences, what would they like to achieve through the campaigns, and use some, let's just call it secret sauce, to make a recommendation to them saying, this is how you should be splitting your budget dollars into search and into display. So the product, what it's supposed to do and what it does is very straightforward and easy to explain. So there was no confusion about it. My friend did a good job, setting the context. And then as soon as he started talking about the product and its features, one of the executives asked for the link to the product to play around. And of course, my coworker has, prominently displayed the beta version of the product to play around with. So, needless to say that, some of the, people in the room started playing with the product while my coworker started talking about the product features. So that was the situation. And what my coworker was seeking as part of the presentation was an approval for a beta launch to the large advertisers. And he was trying to make a case why it makes sense in order to launch it for the benefit of large advertisers. But then as he started still talking beyond the second slide where he highlighted some of the key features of the product, one of the executives played around and used a search-only advertiser as an example to look up what the budget recommender would say. And since the executive already know, coming from the search advertising space, the expectation was that the product would automatically say that $0 for display and all for search, because that is the ground reality, right? Because the advertiser never believed in display advertising. They never expressed interest, nor would run any campaign in display. And it is very clear from their goals as well that they wouldn't want to put any money whatsoever on the display side of advertising. But interestingly, the product recommended a 50-50 split between search and display advertising. Now, as soon as that happened, the senior executive raised his hand and said, well, I looked up for this X customer X, who is known to be search-only advertiser. How come your recommender is saying split 50-50 between display and search? And my coworker was speechless for a moment. He was caught off guard because it was totally unexpected. And everyone knew in that room that the product did not do the right thing because it did not match the ground reality, right? So it was a pretty awkward silence for a few moments. And then my friend backed up quickly and said, abruptly closing the presentation, saying that he would have to do some more homework along with his tech leads and then come back with a revised proposal. Until then, he excused himself and the team and actually left the room, short-circuiting the presentation. This was a classic case of a problem that could be prevented or could have been caught before had my friend sought help from one of the other product managers or the tech lead to do some spot checks. Right now, sorry that I already transitioned into the learning part of it, where an extra pair of eyes to review and catch any obvious errors would have done the trick, and he could either have tweaked the product or bought some time to come back at a later time when the product did the right thing to match with the ground reality. So again, to reiterate, before the presentation, get some help, not yourself, because you would be so close to the product and the presentation that sometimes it is very hard for seeing the problem yourself. That is the reason I'm calling here very clearly extra pair of eyes to review and catch any errors as a key takeaway. So that concludes our story number 2. So again, a small pause before we get to our story number 3. So I'm sure a lot of you can relate to explaining the calculations of numbers, be it revenue impact, be it cost reduction, or the productivity impact, as part of your presentations, making a case how your product would bring about that impact. So going back to the situation in this third story, I have done a presentation where my product was supposed to improve the sales productivity such that in a 40-hour week, my product would cut down 2 hours of their time in doing some unnecessary things that a salesperson could productively use to spend time with either a customer or pursuing an opportunity, which is generally seen as a more valuable investment from their time. So again, the situation was that I was presenting or making a case through my product, through the presentation, that my product would save 2 hours of a salesperson's time on a weekly basis. And while explaining the numbers, the task at hand for me was to quantify what is the benefit, not just in terms of the number of hours, but to translate them into headcount, which is commonly used language or lingo that everyone was talking about at the time. So that is what I was expected to do as part of this presentation. And what I actually did was to actually show the calculation, right? That 2 hours savings on a weekly basis for a 10,000 person sales team would result in 20,000 hours of savings. But what I did not do at the time was to show the math, how it would translate to 500 people headcount as the value or the impact. So one of my executives caught me and said, Ravi, can you explain to me, how do you translate the 20,000 hours that you're talking about as a savings for the salesperson's time equates to 500 people headcount? And at that moment, of course, it's a very simple calculation, and I knew this all along. But at that moment, in the large number of people, under the scrutiny of very senior people, I blanked out at that moment, because I did not really anticipate this question, and I was not prepared to explain how a 20,000 hours of savings for sales would translate to 500 people as a headcount. The math was very simple. When you divide 20,000 with 40, which is the hours in a week for a given headcount, you would get the actual number in terms of headcount as a savings, 500. So all I needed to do was to divide 20,000 with 40, and there you go, you get the answer. But at that moment, it didn't occur to me, and I looked like an idiot, right? And my coworkers and executives all knew that they were not doubting what I showed them. They knew that there is a very clear way to explain it. But then, because I was not prepared to explain in a very simple way, I couldn't really explain the numbers properly. So walking away from that experience now about the learning, if only I just rehearsed, very quickly. If someone asked me how to explain a 2-hour savings for a salesperson for a 10,000 people salespeople organization would equate to 500 headcount, I would just present the math exactly as I showed on the slide. 2 multiplied by n, where n is the number of salespeople, divided by 40, and there you go. That is how you get the numbers. It's very simple in hindsight to explain this, but the key takeaway here is that when you're showing numbers, especially, even if they're very simple, it's very important for you to practice or rehearse. How exactly are you going to explain the numbers in a way that not you, but other people would get it and understand it? So that is the key takeaway from the story number 3. Let's again, pause for a moment before we go to my next story. So my next story is a very easy to relate to for most of the people, here, as well as in product management community. Sometimes we see being asked a lot of questions is not a good thing. It's seen as something like people don't trust you, don't believe you, or you're having tough time explaining what you're trying to convey or communicate to the people. But depending on the topic and the depth of the topic, sometimes it might require a lot of Q&A inherently as part of the topic. So as a general rule, it is better to expect being asked questions is a good thing, and it is a way to sense that your audience is engaging with you. They are interested in the topic, and they want to know some answers for some difficult questions that they may have, and therefore they are bringing up these questions. So the situation here is, sometime back, one of my coworkers was presenting various levers that the product owners can use to gain the resource efficiency in their life cycle. What specifically we're talking about is when compute, storage, and network are the infrastructure resources which are used by every product. There are some levers that the product is providing that could be used by the product owners so that the resources are more efficiently used by the product owners, which basically allows them to pack more workload with the same given resources. That is the topic, and the presentation was about how exactly the product owners get such benefits. And it is a how-to, like, number one, do this, and you should be able to get this much of benefit. Second, do this, and this is how you do it. And the amount of benefit you get from number two would be so and so. So that is the nature of the presentation. And the situation was exactly as I explained so far. Now, the audiences was a lot of executives as well as the product owners. By product owners, we mean the likes of Google advertising, Google search, YouTube. These are all major enterprise scale products that would need huge amount of resources in geographically dispersed data centers in the form of abstract compute, storage, and network, including main memory and SSD that I'm glossing over a little bit, but you get the gist. Now, because of the nature of the presentation itself, the task at hand for my coworker was to simply stick to the format and say, the first lever is this, recompile your code, the production service, so that it uses smaller memory footprint and uses less amount of computation, and therefore you would benefit. This is how you benefit, and the quantity, the magnitude of the benefit is so and so. And so on and so forth for the level number 2, level number 3, etc. He did a fine job, explaining all the levers, but then because the topic is so involving, as you can tell, that this is not a very simple conversation. So people had naturally a lot of questions. And of course, my coworker also did a fantastic job by pointing out a link where there is a lot of Q&A, or rather answers to commonly asked questions. But then the problem was that people were looking at it for the first time. So it wouldn't preempt them from asking a lot of clarifying questions. And therefore, they had to become part of that presentation. So initially, my friend was enthusiastic about supporting some of the questions, thinking that it is a way to sense the interest in the presentation and that the audiences was engaged with him. But then he started getting annoyed very quickly because the number of questions started going up quite drastically, and he was being interrupted pretty frequently. It could be, sometimes the case that, you may have to be interrupted, but then you should have been prepared with a positive attitude that there may be a lot of questions and be prepared for the questions. So we so far talked about the situation, the task or the action expected of my friend, which also we talked about. And now the result was, also something that we talked about. Lots of questions and then frequent interruptions of the presentation, so that my friend was stuck in the first few slides, and he had like a dozen levers that he could talk about. And even going through 6 of them would be a fairly good success, but he was nowhere close to that. And it took an hour, and hardly he was able to cover about 6 or 7 slides. There was still a lot more to go. Now, looking back, there are definitely a couple of learnings. The first was to send the slide deck ahead of time, along with the link to commonly asked questions and answers. But then again, you cannot expect that people would look at the link and be prepared before the presentation, because people may have been busy with a lot of other things. So you cannot expect that. So what is more important lesson from this experience is that you should solicit questions. You should put a smiling face to answer them, and be receptive to being asked and being interrupted. And this is one of the reasons that you should be prepared for twice the amount of time that you would need to talk for the overall presentation, because half the time might be needed for the Q&A. So let's pause here for a moment before we go to the last story of the day. So I'm smiling because this is a cliche. To keep it simple, a lot of people might tell you this. You might probably know this already resoundingly, but then I have a specific meaning behind keep it simple. Let me just walk you through this story today. The situation here is that one of my UX researcher was presenting the key findings from emerging markets on consumer research of search. So that was the topic, and the pre-work done by the UX team, product management, and a lot of other people was this research with small and medium-sized businesses, mom and pop stores in emerging markets, about the expectation they have on search, how would it work, and what their experiences are. And then the presentation was about a synthesized version of the key findings, not the laundry list of the research that we have done, right? So that was the topic. And the situation was that about 5 or 6 different findings were supposed to be reviewed with the executives in a 30 minutes presentation. And this was hardly enough time to go through any details, but just enough to cover the key findings in a summary format, and then field any questions for half of the time. So in other words, in a 30 minutes presentation, we should have expected 15 minutes for Q&A and 15 minutes for going through the key findings. But my friend started going off the script and thought that it's important to set the stage first by talking about the actual interviews and the research, which is a lot more elaborate topic. So that is what the situation was. The task at hand was to actually go through the research findings, but in net effect, what my friend or my coworker did was to go through the laundry list of the use cases that we collected, or rather the interviews that we captured in the emerging markets. So, as you can tell, people had a lot of questions, and by the time we reached half the allocated time, my coworker was still on slide number 1, and we had not even covered the gist of the findings and what were the major findings that we uncovered from the emerging markets. So as a result, the half an hour felt like complete waste of time because we couldn't even get to what the key findings are. Not even the slide, nor even one of those findings could be covered. So now looking back, the key learning from this is that as a presenter, you have to assess what the key messages that you would like to communicate in a given amount of time. And in this particular case, the UX researcher had to present the findings, which would have needed about 10 to 15 minutes of time. So he would have been better off kicking off the presentation with the key findings, or maybe even an executive summary of we should have positioned the product in this manner because X, Y, and Z as the findings are the reasons. And that would have captured the major part of the presentation. And in 5 minutes, he could have covered the main goal of the presentation. But when I came to talk about keep it simple, what I meant was that based on the amount of time that you have, based on the specific message that you want to give, or the ask that you have of the executives, you got to get to the point as quickly as you can and as succinctly as possible, because first you cover that aspect, then you are free to talk about any other tangential topics or the Q&A that people might have. So keep it simple is about tailoring or making your presentation very, very targeted for a specific purpose, the audience, and the amount of time that you have. That is what I had in mind. So, for example, in this case, the up-leveling would have been a key, what I would say, takeaway, because the executives were looking for what exactly did we find, about 6 months of research. And you can't go about talking about every nitty-gritty detail there. So again, coming back, fewer slides, up-leveling the presentation would have been the right format for this presentation. Now, if there were more people in the room and we had an hour or 90 minutes to walk through, or a workshop style kind of a presentation or a forum, would have allowed my coworker to talk about a lot more in detail of the research that we have done and then get to the findings towards the end. But that was not the case here. So convey the main themes, and it is not necessary that you need to hit the whole content, but it is more about hitting the key themes, getting them sooner than later as part of your presentation. So that concludes my fifth story of the day. And I would like to thank all of you for your patience. And if not learned anything new, I hope you got at least a little bit mildly entertained. And again, thanks a lot for your time. If there is time for Q&A, we'll wait for that time. But this concludes my presentation. Thank you.